Good morning. I have the honor of introducing Melanie Berry. Miss Berry has extensive experience working with high-risk youth and families. Miss Berry began her career in New York, providing intensive early interventions for young children with developmental disabilities. Currently, Miss Berry is a research assistant at the University of Oregon, where she studies the impact of early experiences that early experiences have on young children.
Hi, good morning. It's so good to be here. I'm really honored to be invited to talk with you all. And I just want to acknowledge that I know you all have very busy lives and full work schedules. And I know personally what it takes to take a full day, away from home and away from work to come to a conference like this. And so my hope is that the information that I'm about to share with you really will be helpful. And we'll have pieces that you can take back and put to use, tomorrow or Monday when you're back at work. So that's my hope today. And with that, let's get started. So thank you for the kind introduction. Just to build on that a little bit, it's really interesting for me to be here as a researcher, sharing the science of early development with you, because my background is that I'm a clinical psychologist. So my training was in, working hands-on with families, doing assessment and individual and family therapy. And it was really kind of a journey that landed me working in a brain science lab at the University of Oregon. And what happened for me is that I was working in inner city Oakland and San Francisco with children who had experienced that pileup of adversity factors and were really experiencing toxic stress. And I was often working with them at, age 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 or 12. And by the time I saw them, the cumulative toll that the stress they had experienced had exacted on them was so high. And I really felt like their development was really quite far off track. And so when I learned about the work that was being done at the Stress Neurobiology and Prevention Lab where I now work, I was really inspired by this idea that we should be looking earlier. Because I knew that those kids who I loved so much and I cared about so deeply, I knew that their problems had started very early and that a lot of factors had come together to get them so far off track to where they were in an intensive day treatment program. And so it's really been a meaningful change for me to kind of trace the problem back to the roots, which start often, for many children, start pre-birth or in the earliest years, and to switch gears to really supporting families in those earliest years. So that's why I'm standing here today talking with you and not doing play therapy, which I really loved. Play-Doh and toy cars is really where my heart is, but here I am. Okay, I need to switch screens, but let me see if I can remember what the gentleman told me to do. There we are, fantastic. Okay, before we dive in, I just want to acknowledge that the work I'll be sharing with you today really represents certainly not my efforts. I'll be sharing research with you from scientists and practitioners at the Oregon Social Learning Center and the University of Oregon. Our lab is jointly housed at those two places, and the Center on the Developing Child. So the initial part of my presentation, the 3 core concepts I'll be sharing with you, come from the Harvard Center. And that's where we're going to start. I'm going to talk you through these 3 core concepts in early development, and I imagine that some of you have seen these videos before, and if so, that's great, because I know that for myself personally, every single time I watch these videos, I learn something new, and I'm inspired differently. So we're going to talk through them, and they really kind of paint this picture of how important early development is, the potential impact of toxic stress, and the critical role of caregiving. And I think this science, it can do 2 things. On the one hand, it can inspire us and it can motivate us to intervene on behalf of young children. But more than that, I think it can give us a clue as to what we can do and why. So hold both of those things in mind as you watch these videos. The first core concept that we're going to talk about is this idea that early experience builds brain architecture. that early childhood is this critical period, and it sort of highlights the importance of caregiving in shaping the brain. And this idea that what happens in those early years can provide either a strong, kind of sturdy, or a weak, fragile foundation for everything to come for that child.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
Great. So let's just recap. That was a lot in 60 seconds. So what we know is that you can think of genes as being sort of like the blueprint for that house image that you saw for the architecture of the brain. But I like to think of experience as being kind of like the carpenter. And the carpenter really shapes how that plan is manifest. And you can imagine handing the same set of blueprints to two different carpenters, one who's quite skilled and knows how to shape up a house really well, and another who's really struggling and challenged, and you could end up with two really different houses, right? It's just like that with early development. The same child can come into this world with the same set of potential capabilities and vulnerabilities, but depending on the environment that they find themselves in, you can wind up with a very different child by the age of 3 or 4. And now you all know a little bit about why that is. It's not a mystery. We know that in the earliest years there's this proliferation of brain cells, and that those cells are sending electrical signals to communicate with one another, and those connections turn into circuits. And it's experience that determines which circuits grow strong and which fade away. So now you're all sort of brain scientists at this point. You can go back to your offices and field questions about early brain science to your colleagues. Along those lines, what we know also is that the ability of the brain to change decreases over time. And on the flip side of that, the physiological effort required to enhance neural connections increases. And so those early years are a time of really great opportunity, but also great vulnerability, because the impact of experience during those years is so great, so enhanced. And the reason is sort of what we just saw, that as the brain becomes increasingly specialized, it becomes difficult for it to sort of reorganize and change. Or as those circuits become stronger, they become a bit more fixed, and it takes more effort to shift them. A great example of this is language, so that we know by the end of the first year, the part of the brain that differentiates different vocal sounds is becoming increasingly attuned to the sounds that are part of the language in which the child's immersed. And the flip side of that is that the child is less sensitive to the sounds that they're not exposed to. So that's a really simple, kind of concrete example of brain plasticity. And And so what this all means is that it's easier to get things right in the earlier years than it is to fix them later. And I think we all know this sort of intuitively, but it's nice to know that the brain science sort of backs up what we all know on sort of a gut level. And this is certainly not to say that we shouldn't invest in the later years. Those kids need us. And those adults need our help, only that we might not have to work quite so hard if we were able to catch those individuals earlier and get it right the first time for them. I see people kind of nodding their heads. This probably makes a lot of sense. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir a bit. And this sort of brain science is reinforced by economic research. So this is a sort of conceptual graph of a return on investment curve that was created by the Nobel laureate Jim Heckman, showing that investing in prevention and early intervention is more effective and efficient than investing in sort of more costly remediation later on. So we're talking about things like intensive mental health services, vocational training, forensic settings, for instance, where sometimes folks end up receiving services in the later years. And if you can sort of mentally map this graph onto the graph I just showed you, I think it's no coincidence, right, that our rate of return on investment is highest when we're intervening when the brain is most flexible, most plastic. So I want to pause before we move on and just encourage sort of a moment of reflection for you. How does the idea that early experience builds brain architecture, how is that relevant to your work or your experiences? Why is it important, and what are the implications for kids, parents, service providers, and researchers? So what is kind of the question I'm asking here. Why does this matter? The next concept that we're going to talk about is this idea that caregiver-child interaction shapes brain circuitry. And this idea that sensitive, responsive interaction between children and their significant caregivers is really essential for healthy brain development.
The key to forming strong brain architecture is what's known as serve and return interaction with adults. In this developmental game, new neural connections form in the brain as young children instinctively serve through babbling, facial expressions, and gestures. And adults return the serve, responding in a very directed, meaningful way. It starts very early in life, when a baby coos and the adult interacts and directs the baby's attention to a face or hand. This interaction forms the foundation of brain architecture upon which all future development will be built. It helps create neural connections between all the different areas of the brain, building the emotional and cognitive skills children need in life. For example, here's how it works for literacy and language skills. When the baby sees an object, the adult says its name. This makes connections in the baby's brain between particular sounds and their corresponding objects. Later, adults show young children that those objects and sounds can also be represented by marks on a page. With continued support from adults, children then learn how to decipher writing and eventually to write themselves. Each stage builds on what came before. Ensuring that children have adult caregivers who consistently engage in serve and return interaction, beginning in infancy, builds a foundation in the brain for all the learning, behavior, and health that follow.
And I always say, I think that's where we come in, right? That's why we're all here. It's what got us out of bed early this morning into the conference. So just to recap, serve and return interaction shapes brain circuitry. So children serve in so many ways, right? They look at things, they make sounds or they speak, they move around, they have facial expressions, and adults or caregivers return that serve when they respond in any developmentally supportive way. And this sort of little back and forth that happens between children and their caregivers is really critical for early development and early brain development. We know that this works best within the context of a trusting relationship, and that it occurs not only inside the home, but also in other contexts, childcare, early education environments. So again, I just want to invite you to sort of reflect on this. And if you could each just sort of take a moment and think of an example of serve and return interaction that you've seen. Maybe it was in the context of your professional work or your personal life, or at the grocery store yesterday, but can you think of a moment when a young child initiated somehow? Did they point? Did they look at something? Did they say something? And was there an adult nearby, any adult, who noticed and then responded? You're holding an example in mind? Wonderful. And can you think of a child who you know, whether it's professionally or personally, who experiences plenty of serve and return? More often than not, in the course of their day, there's an adult somewhere nearby who's going to notice what they're interested in, notice what they're doing, and respond, support them, interact with them. Can you think of an example of a child who you know or who you've known who hasn't had a lot of serve and return? Maybe there just aren't adults around, or maybe the adults who are around are busy, or they're stressed, or something else is getting in the way for them, and they're just not there to notice and respond very often. The next core concept that we're going to talk about is toxic stress, and this came into play in that, thank you so much, this was part of the theory of change video that we just saw. The idea is that science has shown us that toxic stress can really derail healthy development for young children.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So the main ideas here are that when we are stressed and when young children are stressed, our bodies activate a physiological response that includes increases in heart rate, blood pressure, and stress hormones like cortisol, and we'll talk a little bit more about cortisol in a moment here. Short-lived stress can actually promote growth. It's part of a child's typical experiences that help develop a healthy stress response system. But when stress is intense and prolonged and it happens in the absence of a supportive caregiver, it becomes what we call toxic. And it can really impact the developing brain. And I think it's interesting to note here that neglect, or the absence of that serve and return interaction, really, it's a double whammy. Because first of all, the absence of serve and return in and of itself is a stressor for children. You saw that in the video, right? But also, the presence of a supportive, nurturing caregiver has the potential to actually buffer the child from other sources of adversity. So when a child is experiencing neglect, they're experiencing that double whammy, the stress of the absence of serve and return, and they're missing out on that protective factor. I think that's really interesting. I want to talk just a little bit more about the biology of adversity, and we think about there being 3 levels of stress. First is what we would actually call positive stress. So when young children experience just typical day-to-day stressors, they fall down, they scrape their knee, they have to say goodbye to mommy or daddy when they're dropped off at childcare, they have a doctor's appointment and they have to get a shot, and that makes them stressed. Those sort of stresses, when they happen in the context of a supportive, nurturing, caregiving relationship, actually promote the development of a healthy stress response system. Kids need that. Even more serious stressors like a serious illness in the family or significant conflict can be tolerable for children when they occur in the context of a supporting caregiving relationship or relationships. Because those relationships, again, sort of buffer the child and prevent what could be more damaging impacts of that stress. And as I said, it's really when stress is extreme and prolonged, sort of unrelenting, and it happens in the absence of supportive adults that a child can be affected by toxic stress. And toxic stress can be caused by any number of things. These may be familiar to you depending on the type of work you do with kids and families, but poverty can be a source of stress for children. Conflict or violence within the home. Abuse certainly is a source of toxic stress for children. Parental mental health issues, parental substance use issues, violence in the community. And like we saw in that initial theory of change video, sadly, many of the kids that I work with have experienced a pileup, and it started before they were born. And that stress, that toxic stress, can really alter levels of brain chemicals and weaken the architecture of the developing brain. And that can lead to difficulties later on in life. And I really want to point out here that that's not necessarily true for every child, right? We know that some children are very resilient, some families are very resilient, and even in the face of that adversity, somehow they find a way. And it's certainly also not the case that if a given child experiences this toxic stress and it does impact their brain architecture, that's not necessarily a life sentence. We know that you can intervene later with kids and families and help them get back on the right track. But going back to what we learned about brain plasticity, we also know that it's going to be very hard work to intervene and support families later on. Along those lines, there's a growing body of research that shows us that the noticeable impact of stress can be detected very early. This is a bit of research that was very foundational to the field by Hart and Risley. They published these findings a while back. And what they showed, I'm just going to pull the graph up for you first. They looked at the language experiences of young children in the home, and they were interested in differences across the SES spectrum. So I think what they were curious about is one particular form of adversity and one particular source of stress, which is poverty. So what they did is they took a sample of families. They worked with about 42 families, and they took language samples for an hour once a month, starting when the child was very young, about 7 or 9 months of age. And they took these language samples on a monthly basis for several years of the child's life until they were about 3. And they looked at a couple of things. One thing they were interested in is just how much language the children were exposed to in the home and what sorts of language. And what they found was that income mattered. And the families who were very comfortable financially, that was associated with higher levels of language exposure in the home. So just on a word-for-word basis, though the children in the higher SES homes were exposed to more language per hour by a lot than the families in the lower SES homes. And that those differences were associated with differences in the children's vocabulary level and their rate of acquisition of new words, and it was quite pronounced. So what you see in this graph is actually their cumulative vocabulary across time. And you see that the differences emerge as early as 18 months, and by the time the child's 3, they're really pronounced. So the bottom line is the families that were very low SES, many of them were welfare recipients. The middle line, the blue line, is what they called working class families, and the high line was higher SES families who were also college educated. So you see this impact is evident very early on in the child's life. And interestingly, they did some longitudinal follow-up with a subset of these families, and they found that these language differences at age 3 were highly predictive of the child's language abilities in 3rd grade. And what we know about language abilities in 3rd grade is that that's predictive of a whole host of things. Whether or not you're likely to graduate high school, attain further education, employment opportunities later on.
So what happens when they're learning 2 languages?
That's a great question. So this sample was not looking at 2 languages, but there is a really big body of literature looking at that. There's actually a lab at UO that studies that. It's not my area of expertise, so I can't speak to it, but it's very interesting. There's, as I understand it, the story is really complex. So in some ways, sometimes children who are exposed to 2 languages may appear to be a bit behind the curve, even just relative to comparable peers, but there's often a catch-up process that happens later. There are other skills associated with that bilingualism that I'm not familiar with, but it's a really important question. Thank you for asking.
Is it compound when you have generational problems?
That's a great question also. Based on my clinical experience, I would think so, but that isn't something that they looked at in their study. So the next bit of research we're going to look at is related to the developmental status of maltreated children, so children who are involved in the child welfare system. This was a study that did an analysis of the National Early Intervention Longitudinal Study data, looking at the rate or the number of risk factors, so maltreatment experiences and other sources of adversity that a child involved in the child welfare system had or was known to have, and their likelihood for certain outcomes. And this graph in particular is looking at developmental delays. And across the bottom, you see the number, the quantity of known adversity and risk factors. And before I pop it up, does anyone have a guess of the shape of this graph? So what this data is telling us, this is again about that pile up, right? The pile of boulders. We know that there is more than just an additive effect of stress and adversity, that there's kind of a cumulative toll that these risk factors have on children, so that, by the time a child has experienced that full pile up of adversity factors, there's a very high likelihood that that's had a negative impact on their development. This was in particular looking at children under the age of 3. So again, just an opportunity to reflect here. Do you work with families who've experienced toxic stress? Or in your personal experience, do you know folks? What does toxic stress look like for them? Or in your personal experiences, what have you seen? Is this research congruent with that, or do you feel like there are pieces missing? Are there other questions we need to be asking? And in your experience, how does adversity and toxic stress impact development? So I think that body of research really points us towards some keys for healthy development. Based on what we know about early brain development, it suggests a balanced approach to emotional, social, cognitive, and language development starting very early in life. What we know about caregiving and how that impacts brain development leads us to understand that supportive relationships and positive learning experiences that begin with parents but are strengthened by others outside of the home are essential. And we know that we need highly specialized interventions as early as possible for children and families who are experiencing significant adversity. So I'm going to switch gears here. We've kind of gone through that core story, what we know about early brain development, the role of caregiving, and the potential impact of toxic stress. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about some findings that have come out of our lab at the University of Oregon. Some specific effects of toxic stress, and our research has been with children in foster care. But I'm also going to tell you what I like to call the silver lining or the good news side of the story about brain plasticity. It can be very heavy. And I can see it in the room as I go through that earlier research about the impact on brain development of toxic stress. It can be very heavy to sit with that reality and to contemplate the effects of adversity on young children. But what's exciting is that there's also that good news side of the story about brain plasticity, right? And the payoff of getting in there early and supporting kids and families. So we're going to talk about both those pieces as we go through this research. So the first study that I'm going to tell you about has to do with cortisol. And to talk about cortisol, we have to talk about the HPA axis, or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This system is part of the neuroendocrine system, and it's involved in stress regulation and other bodily processes like digestion, immune system, and mood. And cortisol plays a very important role. And stay with me here. I'm getting a little nerdy and brain sciencey. But remember, I'm a clinical person, and I've only come to this sort of in my second life as a researcher. And it was overwhelming to me at first, too. But stick with it, because this is really interesting stuff if you work hands-on with kids and families. So in this study, the lab looked at monthly early morning and evening cortisol levels and assessed those over a 12-month period in a sample of 3 to 6-year-old foster children who were enrolled in a randomized trial of a family-based therapeutic intervention. They had about 117 children in the intervention condition, and 57 in a regular foster care, 57 were in a control sample, and they also had a regular foster care sample. So just to clarify, there was a number of kids who were enrolled in this therapeutic foster care program, which was just a very sort of wraparound, comprehensive program that had services for the caregiver, the child. There's also a case management component. Then there was a sample of children that were just in regular foster care, getting services as usual. And then there was a sample of community control kids, just typical kids from the community that weren't involved in foster care. And this is what they saw. What you see at the top here, the graph that sort of starts high and goes down over the course of the day, that's a typical diurnal or day-night cortisol pattern. Most of us and most people experience this pattern where you start high, when you wake up and you get out of bed, your cortisol levels are actually at the highest point, and then over the course of the day they get lower and lower, so that at bedtime your cortisol levels are quite low, and that's a typical healthy functioning HPA axis. What they saw in the sample of foster kids at the beginning of the study, so at baseline, before the intervention had happened, is that the children in foster care had very atypical cortisol patterns. And in particular, what was very interesting, if I could draw your attention to the bottom of the screen where you see that very flat graph that starts low and stays low, they saw this pattern was associated particularly with children who had experienced neglect. Their pattern started low and stayed low throughout the day. And my sort of very clinical way of thinking about this is it seems to me almost like their fuses blew, right, in their little stress response system. So they start low and stay low throughout the day.
Can I ask, so cortisol does what for you?
It's part of your stress response system in the HPA axis, and the HPA axis is also involved in other biological processes like sleep, digestion, and the like. So it's very important. Great question. Oh, excuse me. And that start low, stay low pattern was associated with anxiety and mood problems. So they were seeing some really real world associated problems that these kids were maybe not surprisingly having. So again, this low cortisol level in foster children was associated particularly with neglect, which we can think of as sort of the absence of serve and return. And that same pattern of cortisol activity has been observed in other studies of foster children and in internationally adopted samples. So this is a pretty robust finding. It's important to note that low cortisol levels was not the result or not associated with physical abuse or other types of abuse, like sexual abuse or emotional abuse. This pattern was tied closely to neglect. And neglect is important because, as many of you may know, neglect accounts for the vast majority of founded maltreatment cases. So this is data from a nationally representative sample of child welfare from 2010 showing the breakdown, and I apologize, it's a bit difficult to see, but I'll talk you through it. The breakdown of founded cases of maltreatment, and what you see is that 78% of those cases involved neglect. So this is a lot of our children in the child welfare system. So again, I've given you a little bit of bad news, right? Here's a very specific way that early adversity can negatively impact brain development. Well, here's the good news side of the story. So this graph shows the change in the cortisol patterns over the course of the intervention. So at the front of the graph, you see the cortisol pattern that the children who were enrolled in the therapeutic foster care presented at baseline. They came into it. And you see that start low, stay low pattern. Well, by 3 months, a more typical pattern started to emerge, the green bar, where they were a little bit higher in the morning. And by 6 months, a typical diurnal cortisol pattern had emerged. How exciting is that? It's fantastic to me. You know, I know from my clinical work that we can achieve real, meaningful change in kids and family over time, but how exciting is it to see the neurological underpinnings of that? It's really fantastic.
Physiological impacts in the children that had the low cortisol level throughout the entire day. So did you see were there physical manifestations of that?
How do you mean? What sorts of things are you curious about?
Digestive problems? Did they have constant tummy aches? Were they sick more often?
It's a great question. Sleep is another thing that I often get asked about. Did they measure sleep? They actually didn't measure sleep. I'll have to go back and ask Dr. Fisher that's the director of our lab, whether or not they have any of those measures. I don't know that they did. Again, going back to my clinical experiences, certainly in my experience, vulnerable kids who experience maltreatment do present with other problems that seem to me intuitively tied to the functioning of the cortisol system. It's a great question.
Why does everybody run out of it at the end of the day?
That's a great question. I don't know, the brain science behind that, but I know that that's healthy and that's normative. That's part of our wake-sleep cycle. I think of it as sort of winding down at the end of the day. Maybe that's part of what helps us sort of wind down and sleep at the end of the day. It's a great question.
What was the therapeutic intervention? Was it medication? Was it a healthy foster family?
Yeah, great question. So this intervention in particular was multidimensional treatment for foster care, which some people may be familiar with. It's a multi-component approach, as I said, where the foster caregiver is receiving intensive supports around behavior management and how to facilitate healthy skill development in the children. The children were receiving one-on-one services. And there was also a case management component, and when biological families were involved, they too were also receiving supports. And I don't usually go into a lot of detail about that intervention in particular because it's not available in every community, although it's becoming more widely available. I think what's important about it and what I want you to remember is that it was multi-component. It involved a team approach to supporting these kids and families, and it was intensive. And it was very well timed. So they caught the children just as soon as they could. As soon as the maltreatment was known about and the child was placed in a supportive home, the intensive wraparound services came in. So well-timed, family-based intensive intervention. So another opportunity for reflection here. Does it surprise you that kids in foster care showed this atypical pattern of cortisol levels? No, I see people shaking their heads. Is it surprising that those patterns normalized after 6 months of services? Yeah. What are the implications for our work with kids and families? So I want to share one more study with you. And I know we're a bit behind time. I have maybe 10 minutes more to go. Is that all right? Okay. So the next study I want to share with you is about response to corrective feedback. Again, we're looking at a sample of kids in foster care. This research was done at the University of Oregon, and it showed that children who were exposed to toxic stress showed diminished brain activity in response to corrective feedback on a task requiring executive functioning. And that was a mouthful. I'm going to unpack that for you guys. So what they did is they invited children in foster care and also typical kids from the community into the lab to play kind of a really simple computer task. And while they did the task, they were hooked up to an EEG, an electroencephalograph. So that's the picture you see on the right, the kiddo who's got the little cap on with the little electrodes in. That's actually the director of our lab's son who posed for the picture. So they had this EEG on, and EEG is a way to measure electrical activity in the cortex in the brain in real time. And while they were hooked up, they were engaging in this task. It's called a flanker task. And if you look at the image on the left, that shows you what the child saw on the computer screen. And what they were asked to do is to name the color of the dot in the middle. And we can make this easier or harder for the child by how we color the dots on either side. It turns out if the dots are all the same color, it's pretty easy to, if you know your colors, it's pretty easy to name the color of the dot in the middle. But if you flank or if you surround that dot with other dots of a different color, it's a little harder because you have to kind of like say, oh no, I'm not saying the color of this one, I'm saying the color of this one. And it requires a little bit of inhibition. Like your first impulse might be to say the color that most of the dots are, but you have to kind of hold your tongue there and just name the color of the dot in the middle. So this is the flanker task. And it does rely on what we call executive functions. So those abilities that are housed in the front of the brain that kind of help you control your impulses, plan, work through a task. And if the child got it right, if they said green, the dot in the middle is green, then they saw a smiley face, which you see at the top. They got that positive feedback. And if they got it wrong, if they said it's red, oh, no, it's green, then they would get a frowny face telling them, oh, oops, got that one wrong. And it would just pop up for a second on the screen, and then they would have another chance to go through the task. This is the EEG data from the typical children, the community control group. This is what their activity looked like after receiving a correct answer. And the line on the bottom is what their activity looked like after receiving an incorrect. So when they saw the frowny face. So the blue line is when they saw the smiley face, and the red line is when they saw the frowny face. And what I want to draw your attention to is this gap between the two lines. Now, I'm not a neuroscientist, but what I've learned is that gap tells us that they were actually having a more heightened response to the corrective feedback. And that's adaptive, that's normative. We all have that. You know, if you bump into somebody in line at Starbucks and they kind of, give you a face like, hey, watch it, your brain goes, oh, oops. And you go, oh, I'm sorry. You step back. We all have this response where our brain kind of lights up when we get corrective feedback from the environment, and that's adaptive. This is the data from the children in foster care at baseline. So what do you guys see? There's no gap. There's no gap at all. So their brains were responding the same whether they were getting positive or corrective feedback from their environment.
So was the essence of that then is that the regular development kids, the gap meant that they had a greater brain response to positive reinforcement than negative.
No, great question. And I'm a behavioral therapist, so I understand why you're asking the question, because we know that positive reinforcement is ultimately more effective than correction. No, it was actually that they had less of a response to the corrective feedback. And the reason why that matters is that we need to, although we benefit from higher ratios of positive reinforcement, when the environment does give us corrective feedback, we need to pay attention to that, because it may signal urgent information right? You're about to run a red light and the light turns yellow. You need to have that, whoa, okay, I'm getting some important feedback from my environment that tells me I need to correct my course. You hear somebody honk at you on the freeway because you're deviating out of your lane. You need to jump to attention, hear that corrective feedback so you can act on it. And the kids in foster care at baseline were not having that heightened response to that incoming input of corrective feedback. And it's, it's interesting because I don't think it's hard to imagine the behavioral implications of this, right? For those of us who work with kids in the real world. I think about the kids I've worked with who had such difficulties in a classroom environment. And you can imagine a moment where, say the kiddo on the right is our child who's experienced early adversity and is in foster care, and he's roughhousing around with one of his classmates, and the teacher across the room says, "Hey, Billy, cut it out, keep your hands to yourself." And if his little brain is not taking in that information and having that pronounced response to that corrective feedback, that's going to be a real liability. And adults in that environment, very well-meaning adults, might interpret that as a character problem. He's just a tough kid. He's not trying, right? When in reality, there's a brain-based reason that child's not responding to corrective feedback in the environment. So I think this can be a real wealth of compassion for us to understand the neurological basis of some of those behavior differences. Again, I've given you a bit more bad news, but there is a positive side of this story. So I'll talk you through this. This is the pre-intervention data. What you see on top are the children in typical foster care who just were receiving kind of run-of-the-mill services. And on bottom is the baseline data from the children who were in the therapeutic foster care. And in both cases, before intervention, you see no gap, right? They're not responding to corrective feedback in a typical way. This is the post-intervention data. What do you guys see? The gap, that beautiful, beautiful gap is there. So they were tuning in and responding on a neurological basis more typically to that corrective feedback. That's really exciting to me. And I keep this research in mind when I first start working with a family or a child, and I'm given that child's presentation, somebody's conceptualization or assessment of that child, and this whole laundry list of problems they're having. They're aggressive, they don't follow directions, they don't mind at home. I always have these graphs in my mind. And I think, well, maybe we'll get there though, right? It's not hopeless.
When you say intervention, is it intervention to the parents or to the foster parents?
Good question. So in this particular study, these were children in foster care, and the intervention supported the foster parent, the child, and when the biological families were available, also the biological families.
Because what I see is that children are set in an environment like this, and they get put back in the same environment. And that's what... all this that you've done just went back.
Absolutely, yeah. So how do we maintain these gains when children are, when their placement changes? It's a great question. Well, another thing that they found in this data, another big finding from this study, was that when they were able to get in and support the foster caregiver early, and support the child early, there were fewer placement changes. So, that maybe doesn't address the challenges of transitioning back to the biological home, but another big challenge that foster children face is that they're often those who have the biggest behavior problems are bounced around from home to home to home. And that in and of itself is associated with more negative outcomes. So they did find that when they got in there early and they supported that foster parent and child, the placement was more stable. So that's good news, right? At least we prevented some needless transitions for that child within the context of foster care. But I think what you're speaking to is the importance of continuity of care when kids return home with their biological parents, so that you can create these same therapeutic conditions in the home. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. All right, with that, I'm going to wrap up. So the good news is that some toxic stress effects can be overcome with systematic and well-timed family-based interventions. And I'll just leave you with one last reflective question, which is, based on your experience working with kids and families, what do you think of those findings? Is that relevant to the work you're doing? Does it inspire you? Does it bring up more questions than answers? And just a really quick teaser, I want to let you know that in the afternoon, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the newest intervention that our lab is working on called Filming Interactions to Nurture Development. And our goal there is to get in very early and promote serve and return before that toxic stress has had its impact. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over. Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to take some questions. I think they're going to get a microphone.
Is there any way to access those findings, what you just shared?
Yes, absolutely. So the Center on the Developing Child, let me actually just click through. The Harvard Center on the Developing Child has an amazing website, and if you haven't been on it before, I highly, highly recommend it. I always joke that I feel like you could get a master's degree just like clicking through that website and reading and watching all the videos. Like, it's a really wealth of resources. And the 3 videos that I showed at the beginning are there. They're accessible. There's also a number of working papers that are on the Harvard Center site that summarize some of these findings. And Dr. Fisher, who's the director of our lab, is a co-author on a number of those papers. So these findings about early adversity in foster children are incorporated into some of those working papers. Yeah, great question. There's also, in brief, papers that are like 2 pages long and kind of summarize what we know on a given topic. Like if you're interested in executive functioning, which I just mentioned briefly, they have a great in brief paper that'll talk you through what we know about early adversity and executive functioning.
Is there, I don't know. Is there a number, is there a statistic on the number of children in the United States that are actually suffering from toxic stress? So if you were to take all the children living in poverty and the children that are in foster care and so forth, would you be able to derive a number?
Yeah, it's a great question. It seems like you're just curious about the sheer quantity, the number of kids across the U.S. that are experiencing this kind of adversity. You know, not in my mind. I don't know of any kind of cumulative statistic. We certainly have data on the number of kids involved with child welfare across the U.S. We have separate pools of data looking at the kids experiencing poverty or, who are exposed to domestic violence. But I don't know of any work that really seeks to kind of pool all of that data and get a sheer number. I think it would be very daunting. But it's a great question. Yeah, please.
I'm actually going to talk about that in just a few minutes. But just as a quick teaser, there's, I think, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that was done about 20 years ago now, because it's, I think, a way that we could estimate that. I don't know that I've seen the actual, this many million, but I think we have a good sense of, in communities, how many, sort of the percentage of people who have experienced kind of that pilot of toxic stress that was in the video. So.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jason. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Any other thoughts, questions?
I can scream. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about the flattened cortisol level that you found with children that were in foster care, and then the resulting levels of anxiety disorders. To me, that seems kind of counterintuitive, that a heightened anxiety level would be associated with higher cortisol levels. And what are the implications of working with children and helping them with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So that is kind of counterintuitive, right? We hear stress hormone and we think, well, that's bad. We don't want more stress hormones. But it turns out, just in the course of our day-to-day life, we encounter a number of just sort of typical stressors. So you get stuck in traffic, or you can't find your keys, or your boss gives you, a really difficult thing to work on. And in order to cope with those things in the course of our life, we need a fully functioning, healthy stress response system, a healthy HPA axis. And cortisol plays a really important role in responding to those daily stressors, acting and recuperating, actually. And I don't have time to get into it here, but cortisol plays an important role not only in the initial stress response system, but in recuperating and down-regulating after that stress response. And so you actually need a certain level of that stress hormone in your system to respond adaptively to stress. So it's not the case that we want no stress hormones in our system. We actually need a certain level to respond adaptively in our environment. So I think that's what I would say in response to the first part of your question. The second part, what does this mean for those of us who work with kids? I think it's kind of twofold. I think for me, part of it is just compassion, right? It's to know that those behavioral and emotional problems we see in kids who've experienced adversity are not character. They're not choices, really, in a way that child is making. There's a biological basis for that dysregulation and the anxiety and the emotional challenges that they're having and the corresponding behavioral problems that they're having. And so I think one thing that we can do, those of us who understand this science of really adversity, is that we can hold that compassion and advocate for kids. So when you're in an IEP meeting, or you're in a treatment team meeting, or you're in a clinical team meeting, and you're talking about a child or an adolescent or an older child who's experiencing these effects of toxic stress, you can hold that compassion and that understanding of why, of the potential impact of adversity on that person and the underlying neurobiological differences they may experience, and you can advocate from that place. Helping to hold that context. Let's keep in mind, this child has really experienced a lot of adversity. And you can also hold that plasticity side of the story, right? So when you're on a team where you're getting in a rut and people are talking about, sort of the dead end for this kid, it's just never going to get better. Look how serious their problems are. They're not responding to treatment right away. You can hold in mind that brain plasticity to advocate for appropriate, intensive, family-based, comprehensive work with that child. And you can hold that hope that with those wraparound services, that child can get better. Great question. Thank you for asking. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for having me.